Okay, so recording is recording and audio's on. Okay, so as I was saying, today we are going to just talk about the project. I want to make sure that everything is clear on those two. So as I was saying, we have project A and project B. I think it's, they're worth half and half, right? So project A, if you remember, is, or part A, let's call it. So you should be seeing the whiteboard now. Part A is the risk assessment. Okay, the risk assessment. And then project B is, or part B, as I said, is just some problem that you have defined, which requires, it's related to network security. And we've already talked about these topics, but today I just want to make sure we talk a little bit about them at the very end. So we got network. It's network security. So then, some kind of a network of some kind. It can be as simple as the networks that we have been building in the labs, right? So it doesn't have to be very complex, or you can make it complex if you want. And then it should involve, attacks and control. So for instance, I gave you a couple of examples. If you didn't know what to do, you could just do all the DNS related attack labs and just make sure again that you address both attacks and defense, right? Controls are defense. Okay, I know some of you are doing honeypots or IDSs or things like that. And so those are basically the examples. So we've talked about that. But today, so we'll do the breakout rooms at the very end just to kind of make sure. I won't take a lot of time with the breakouts, just at most 2-3 minutes, just to make sure that every group is now clear on their topic and they're working on it. So that's part B, that's the technical part, if you will. So let's call this one the technical part. Just something, should be something fun that you want to do related to network security. And then there's the non-technical part, and I would say this is the non-technical part. Now, this part is what I'm going to talk about mostly today, all right? So I'm going to dedicate just, really a lecture just to this topic of RCM, which is the risk and control matrix. Now, this is actually extremely important, okay? This is something that, if any time that you're interested in security or access control or assurance, as it's called, all those things don't always have to start with the technical aspects, right? So you don't always have to start at the very technical level. You actually start at a very high level, non-technical level, all right? So you really need to follow some logic, if you're gonna do let's say like a consulting service, or if you work at a company, you work for one of the big 4 accounting firms like KPMG or Deloitte and Touche, all these companies that specialize in doing these audits, right? They do these information systems audits, etc. They just focus on the high level, right? So they're not pen testers. They don't go into the technical side. They really just go into the, the business side, if you will, because that's really where you should start, right? And so there's actually certifications out there for this, like something called the CIA. It's not the actual Central Intelligence Agency. This stands for a Certified Internal Auditor. There's another one called the CISA, and I think this one is called a Certified Information Systems Auditor. And so they just have to do with, information. These are very, very well-paying jobs, and really you just do the high level, right? So my point is, and usually this is why in a lot of the courses, you probably see this concept a lot, right? You see risk assessment, risk and control matrices and everything just being kind of emphasized quite a bit, okay? That you should not, when you think about security, don't just start with the firewall, right? That's not the right approach. You should start at a very high level, just thinking about what it is that the risk assessment is. And that's why, we have this as part of the course, doing this part. All right, so the part A should be very easy. There's, it's basically just creating a report documentation, and then, the presentation. So I usually like to have an example. So there's an example on Brightspace. So now let's go ahead and switch back to Brightspace. So I'm gonna stop this. All right, and let's go back to the Brightspace environment. Hopefully that's still there. So my page is closed. All right, so this is as you can see in the Brightspace environment, you can see here the module is RCM, right? So this one, RCM, Risk and Control Matrix. So I've already provided 3 documents. There's a Word document just to kind of address the project and some of the questions that you might consider. There's an example of a project, of how you should follow your project, how you should do it. And then there's some slides that I have here. So I will just kind of start with the slides. I'll do the lecture. This shouldn't take me that long, but it should kind of underscore what it is that you should do, right? And there's basically what the project should look like. So if I click on this, I think I have to download it actually. So let me download it. So now it doesn't have to be exactly like this. This is just, it illustrates, what you should be considering. Okay. Remember, you can do this if you work at we're obviously right now it's a challenging situation because we are where did it go? Okay. Right now, because of COVID, we can't really focus. Usually what we would do in the university is that, we would work with the university and take different departments or buildings, right? So like Anderson, Potter, if you remember those building names, right? So you would take one building and then you'd be allowed to ask questions from the IT department at the university, of what are the assets that you're trying to protect, what are the risks, and what are the controls, okay? And so this is actually modeled around one of those buildings, Anderson, but really you can just do this, given, this whole pandemic, you can do it either, make up a company, just something small, or if you work, some people I know have asked me that they do work at a company, and so their boss was willing to answer the question. So it's kind of like that, right? So you're going to make a talk about, how do you start a risk analysis and assessment of something? So here you can imagine if you were doing your own project, and I can actually bring this up. All right, so you should now be seeing the slides, right? So imagine I'm just going to show a project, and then after that, we'll look at, more details in the slides of definitions. But in general, what are you trying to do? Imagine you just show up at a place, whatever, Anderson is some company or something, and now you have to start thinking about the IT security, right? So where do you start? That's, do you just say, okay, give me the firewall, and no, right? You don't do that. So you want to start at a very high level, just thinking about the organization in general and thinking about a lot of things. And so what's great about thinking of something called the risk and control matrix is that it really brings together a lot of the things that you're going to need, right? A lot of the things that you're going to need. So usually I like to think of this as you're going to create a binder, of documents, of information, and that's going to be, all the information that you need. There's a reference to the security policies and everything like that, okay? So this is, the idea. So the way that you could do it is, what is the project scope? So determine, first of all, the business objectives of your organization. So in this case, we could think of just, this is an example at P&W of a building like Anderson, okay? So, but here, of course, you're going to plug in whatever your company is. All right. Then what do you need to determine? So then you start to think about what are the things that I need to determine for my organization. And remember, you're looking at this from the point of view of IT. right? For instance, because you could also do a risk assessment from the point of view of accounting and finance, right? So really a lot of these ideas, if you didn't know, came from that field, came from accounting and finance. They've already have been doing it for years. As you know, information systems didn't really start to become a thing until what? Computers arrived in the 40s and then in the 60s and 70s and 80s, right? So as that has grown, it kind of grew from the accounting and finance side. But we're going to focus a little bit more on just the IT side, although a lot of this is pretty similar. So the way that I would describe it when I mentioned those certifications before, the CIA, the Certified Internal Auditor, fits for this. The CISA, which is a fairly straightforward certification to get, fits in on the IT side. But it's still very high level because it's not penetration testing, which would be more low level or something like that. So anyway, as you start to think about the project scope, you will think about the business objectives, of course, and then after that, you're going to get into the you determine what are the assets, right? And we'll define this a little bit more. That's why I have the other set of slides. But basically, you determine what are the assets that need to be protected. And here, it's not just technical, okay? It's not just like, the server, the firewall, the router. It's actually, intangible things, intellectual property, confidentiality of information, things like that, right? So think about like healthcare, for instance, which is governed by HIPAA. So a lot of that information, etc. Then once you've determined the assets, you want to determine possible threats to those assets. Okay, so that's what what are the attacks, or information theft, all kinds of things. So you'll have to think about those. What are all those threats, right? And that's why you need to kind of come up with a list of that and map it to the assets. And then after that, you want to think about the controls, right? The controls just means the defense, right? So remember that the general term for defense, so like a firewall, cryptography, MAC locking, all of that, a device hardening is, it's a control. And so the defense. And then once you do that, you perform some type of a risk assessment. We'll talk a little bit about this, but it can be very informal. And in particular, the risk assessment, what it helps with is it helps with figuring out how to kind of like rank, what is the most dangerous thing to the organization, that could really affect, like if you, it affects the company and it could end up affecting the bottom line seriously. And so you think about that one. And then you put everything together, you create a risk and control matrix. So you'll see me referred to as an RCM, okay? So this is it. What you have to do for this project, you'll create these slides based on the organization that you grab. So if you said, I'm gonna do a hospital, then okay, it has to be relevant to a hospital. If I'm gonna do a factory that's integrated and connected to the cloud, you do that. So you have to really think about your specific domain, the laws, and everything like that. And then, of course, come up with some kind of a network diagram. Of usually this would have been, Anderson's network diagram in some level, right? High level, doesn't have to be too detailed. If you guys are doing this in your own company, I don't expect that your boss will give you the network diagram. So just kind of create one, based on your understanding of it. That's perfectly fine. But this does give some context, right? Because some of the assets are technical, so you want to kind of know, okay, they have a data center and these are the computers in there. So that's basically what you have to do, right? So you establish the project scope, you identify these elements. So for instance, and now we go into the individual ones. So business objectives, the first bullet, right? So we want to think of what that entails. So for instance, for PMW, our example here, the business objectives would be what? Provide an affordable, high quality education, increase school awareness outside of Northwest Indiana, grow enrollment rate, increase retention rate, grow and change as necessary. All right, so, and you know, if you're doing any kind of other organization, let's say like healthcare, so to provide healthcare, you know, health benefits, or if it's a factory, you know, you're business oriented, then, you know, you want to maximize your profits, you want to maximize the wealth of the shareholders, you know, those kinds of things. So you have to think of the business objectives in relation to the organization that you select. Okay, and that's important because it, you know, you have to create. Then remember that one of the axioms of security, right, that we saw at the very beginning was that the business priorities come first, right, not the other way around. So the business, you know, if it can't perform its tasks, then what's the point of the security, right? So you have to think about that in that context. And you can think also in the context of what are the laws that govern this. So are there any laws? Like there's a law called Sarbanes-Oxley, for instance, Sarbanes-Oxley, and then there's HIPAA and, you know, all those other ones. Okay, so you want to identify the climate, the context or the environment in which the organization actually exists. Then after that, the information system. So what does, you know, because you know, your focus really should be on the IT side. So what does the information system provide, right? So provide services. So in the case of P&W, it provides services to students and faculty, maintains and upgrades and standardize classroom, develop active learning and collaboration rooms. Now more than ever, right? You guys have all this, with the pandemic, everything is online, so it's even more important. Develop ways of communicate, have, you know, videos accessible, increase storage, you know, for files, bandwidth and all that. Automate and simplify flow of information across the campus, support high quality teaching focused on student access. So you have to think about all of these as they relate to your own business objectives. You know, what does the IT infrastructure in your organization, what is the objective basically? Then after that, you know, I always think this is such a simple thing to do, and it's actually pretty useful. Then after that, what do you identify? You identify the assets. Okay, so that's your next step, is you want to figure out what are the assets in your organization. So you have your, you know, the physical ones, so the buildings themselves, for instance, that's an asset, right? You don't want somebody to steal a door or something. There's the physical equipment, so routers, switches, cabling, all that. Then there's logical assets. You know, I think here we could probably say intangible assets a little bit better. So data, right? The data now, you know, student data, faculty data, credit card information. So for instance, the CLO market in one of the buildings, right? There's, they do process credit card information. So you'd want to look at that because you guys pay your, you know, you buy your sandwich, at least when you were on campus, or when you're back on campus, you can do that. The availability of the network. So really, you can also start thinking of those principles, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability, non-repudiation, and so on. Okay, and then, you know, infrastructure secrets. So the IP addressing schemes, the security controls, so the network layout itself. You know, and then other information that might be pertinent to this, like if you're, let's say, think about what has been happening this year or last year when all these hacks for SolarWinds, and apparently they even hacked something related to Microsoft, and they got a look at the Windows operating system code. So that's intellectual property. So these are the assets, right? So you know, not all of them, remember, are tangible. Some of them are intangible. So the data itself or information. Okay, so that's the process. Just remember, try to identify it specifically to your organization. So I've made this a little bit more general, but Try to be as specific as possible, okay? Then after that, what are the risks, right? So what are the risks associated with this? And this doesn't just have to be technical risks. It could also be theft, you know? So somebody just walks away with a chair, you know, something like that. But it also can be, you know, malware, you know, ransomware, all that, phishing attempts. It could be malicious activity, denial of service attacks, you know, just exploits, whatever it is, right? I leave it to you guys now at this point. You know, you should be somewhat aware. You've seen a lot of attacks and throughout your courses, and you should have some sense of what are the risks. But the risk could be a disgruntled employee who's a coder, who was a sysadmin, and they go in and they reconfigure the systems, or, you know, don't update the systems, etc. So a lot of things to consider as technical risks. Also consider non-technical risks, as I said. So I guess a little bit of, you know, like fire and things like that. Because that has to do with business continuity, with, you know, like your 352 class, I think it is. All right, so social engineering, impersonator, identity theft, phishing. Okay, so there's that. Configuration errors, access control, privilege, and then, you know, as I said, physical threats, fire, flood, tornado, something. Okay, so power outage, you know, today, right? Internet outage in my case. So a lot of these things happen. These are risks. Anything, again, that will affect those principles, right? You need to kind of quantify as well. So you kind of list out, and that's really the main idea. And then after that comes in the risk and control matrix. So the risk and control matrix is where you start to put this together, okay? You start to put it together. So for instance, you can and the way that you order this can change. So it's up to you. But what's important is they have here assets, threats, and controls. That's why it's called, and threats is risks, right? So R, C is the controls, our risk and control matrix. And the matrix is, because it's like an Excel spreadsheet, doesn't have the word asset in there, but it's fine. Okay, and so this is your risk and control matrix, or your RCM, just a common term for it. Right, very simple model to create what you're trying to do. So then here you'll list out, let's say, your assets, physical equipment, data, you know, faculty and student data, physical equipment, what is the difference there? Right, so maybe be a little bit more specific than this, and so on. So you need to identify what I would say, like we saw before, like tangible and intangible assets, right? And then after that, what are the threats to those? So sure, natural disaster, but also data theft, and of course, a few attacks, right? Some of the network attacks. So this is by no means, this is just an example, right? This is a sample of what you should show. This just kind of very easy overview. And then once you have the threats and the control and the assets, right? And then you can also identify what would be the controls associated with these, right? So locks, you know, firewalls, you know, intrusion detection systems, device hardening, all those things that you're familiar with. And then comes in this part here, which is very important, right? So there's two elements, the severity of the damage, and then the probability, the likelihood that the attack will occur. Okay, so you can see it's really just like a rating or scaling approach. So you can just say, for instance, what is the likelihood that this will happen? Well, you know, that there will be a flood. Okay, so maybe that, let's just say in this area, floods are very rare, so then they would have a very low probability. Or you could say, yeah, well, floods could happen, so then maybe a medium probability. And what this does is it allows you then, based on this information, you can rank what's the most critical, because there could be something that is very likely to happen, but it's not severe, right? So for instance, somebody, I mean, this might, you know, somebody steals the sign outside the building, right? That's a bad example, but yeah, it's bad that they stole the sign, but it's not a severe thing to the company, right? Whereas if they steal intellectual property, your IP, if that gets stolen, then it is pretty severe. Okay, so that would be pretty severe, and so that's something then that you want to identify. Okay, and so that's why you have a ranking system for the severity of this issue, and also a probability that it will happen. Based on that information, then you can produce a ranked risk and control matrix that shows basically the, you know, what's most important, what's less important, so that you can then start to pick, you know, because this will directly educate the expenses, right? So this is going to be tied directly with how much personnel you need for the security, how much equipment you need, etc. Right? You can, sorry, so we did that one. So you can see it here. It's continued. Now you have, in this side, you have more of the attacks, right? So you have data, hardware, more data. So try to be more specific here as to what data you're talking about. And then you can see privilege escalation, network worms, network attacks, rootkit ransomware, misconfigurations, social engineering, virus and Trojans, spyware and adware, spam, phishing attempts, and so on, right? So you identify a long list of threats, and then of course the controls, proper configuration, whatever, firewalls, antivirus scanners, etc. I leave that to you guys. It's, to me, what I would say is what's more important is not so much that you get everything, all the information that's pertinent here, right? The more important thing is to understand the process really well, to do the process from beginning to end really well, so that you could always do the process and do the process and do the process and just get better and better. This is always, as I said, a good starting point from which you can go in, into the more technical details and so on. And here again, you just do the severity of the damage and the probability of this event actually happening. Does this make sense, guys, so far? Are there any questions about what you need to do for a project?
No, it makes sense to me.
Makes sense, right? So this is really all I'm looking for. I need you to create a report. So it's like a Word document with this information. And then, of course, you'll need to have your slides so that you do your presentation. So remember, each group will present this. This is project A. Okay, so remember, that's easy 15 points right there, or 10 points, whatever it is in the syllabus. So, it should be pretty straightforward. And so now then you can arrive at some conclusions, right? Obviously you do all the ranking, you'll do the analysis, and then something like this per our matrix, So this is, imagine you're like a consultant, right? So you do your presentation, and then at the end you would say, well, per our matrix, there are several high priorities and risks for this type of organization in this geographical location and within this context or environment where they are, economic environment. So several of severe damage rates. Some are negligent, not always probable. So you'll just basically identify. I leave that to you. What are the most likely things, biggest concerns, etc. So it's really like your recommendations of what should be in place. So when we're doing this at the university, the advantage is you can just get all these answers, right? You can just ask the information services people, because they usually help us with this. So you just, one day you go into their office and ask them this list of questions for your building. They would give you the answers. But, just make it up, I guess. You should be able to figure it out. And then the presentations will allow us to have a discussion and everything. So then you'll say something like, these risks have been determined to be priority because of the risk assessment that you just performed. Okay, and then obviously the controls. Remember, controls just means defense. this is where now you're going to make your recommendations. Remember, this, if you were doing this report and you're sending it to your boss or you're sending as a consultant to an organization, this is important because this translates into a lot of this, right? So it translates into a lot of money of, you know, training, equipment that needs to be put in place, personnel to run this thing, and so on, right? So there's going to be a lot of the tools. Now that's why, you know, you've seen a lot of this from the Linux point of view, right? So you know what's out there that's open source. There might be some things that you can do open source, but then, you know, that might be very acceptable to your organization depending on the size, or they just want to, you know, really buy equipment, etc. So at the end of the day, this is a business decision, okay? More so than anything, you're making an assessment, right, and a recommendation, but ultimately this report would become a business decision. So, you know, network access control, the ACLs, you know, the policies basically. Remember that a lot of this is going to be in policies. You know, technologies like deep freeze, antivirus, MAC locking, device hardening of routers, keys, and also simple things like lock the doors, right? Separating the networks, monitoring. As I said, these are some of the, for instance, for Anderson, these are some of the things that they have in place. So VLANs, but also training, right? So they train not only the technical people, but training the employees. So what's one important good example of training? You know, remind your employees not to share their password, not to do those kinds of things, right? Updates, we all know that updates are extremely critical. Maintenance, throttling the network, video cameras, spam filtering, and so on. So lots of things. I leave that again to you guys to kind of, you know, decide. That's why it's a project, right? So pick a company and try to create it, right? Try to create it as best as you can, and so on. All right. Then, you know, just for context for us, you know, whatever organization you're doing, you know, try to come up with some kind of a network or diagram, let's say, of the network that they would have in place. It doesn't have to be that technical, but you can see here, as I said, this is just the Anderson building. So where they have the main distribution frames, et cetera, where all the network cabling is, the network closets, basically. And so you can do something a little bit like that. So you can give that organization of your building connections to the ISPs where everything is located, and then some kind of a little network like that, right? So obviously this is, again, this would have been given to you, at least it would have been described to you if we were doing this on campus at the individual buildings, but since we can't do that right now, so let's just, you can create the network. Keep it simple. You know, however you want to do it is fine. And that's it. So this will give us a little bit of context. Usually I would recommend that you put this at the beginning, not at the end, because by putting this at the beginning and describing it, we kind of get a big picture of, oh, okay, this organization does this. This is the equipment that they have. Please don't just tell me, oh, by the way, we just have everything in the cloud and they take care of it, right? So don't do that. Try to go through the exercise of assuming that you have it and you deal with it. Okay. All right, and I think that's it. Oh, yeah, and then they just went into more detail of all the actual equipment that they have in the closets. You can do that. You can identify the different devices. That's fine. And that's it. As you can see, the risk and control matrix is a very simple project, but it's actually, I've always believed that this is really important because it allows you to it gives you a structure structured approach to think about security, even if your organization is really large, right? You can always do that. You can always also, as we did, if you notice, one key thing, when we looked at the campus, the university, for instance, we didn't look at the whole campus, right? Instead, we did it by building, kind of that way we, you know, we keep the scope a little bit smaller, and then, you know, we can see similarities by discussing each individual building together. And that's it. That's the risk and control matrix. Are there any questions about these slides? All right, doesn't sound like there's any questions. So let's go back to Brightspace. I think on Brightspace, I did provide another document. You should be seeing this one, the term project, RCM. So you can just see here, pretty much the same thing, right? Pretty much the same thing for part A, the RCM project. Define the business. Business may be assigned by instructor, but in this case, not. So what is produced or what service done? Where located? What are the IT requirements? What departments doesn't have? Then define the business objectives, define all assets, risk assessment, define all threats to a particular business, and map them to business objectives and security controls. Basically what I just discussed, by impact of each threat and rank controls. And then you can include a description of the business, risk assessment, and impact. So it's the grid of business objectives to threats to controls. And then do the risk and control matrix, which is, you know, the table of assets, threats, and controls. Discuss aspects of each technology, such as device hardening, you know, and then provide some diagrams, network diagrams, and then write the report. So remember, you'll do a report of this, and then you'll do the presentation during the week before finals. And that's it. That is your term project. Project A, that's term project A. So at this point, as far as I see it, if you want more additional information of the risk assessment, like more definitions, etc., there's an additional set of slides here that you can take a look. It's got more information, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory, so you can just read through that document. Okay. So if I'm not hearing any questions about this, what I want to do now is, you know, given that we're very close to the end of the semester, I want to create the breakout rooms, and I just want to make sure I know, you know, it's kind of like a status update of your project B. So remember, if I go back to the whiteboard, right, we have project A and project B. So now, hopefully, unless I hear any questions, I assume that everybody understands what they need to do with project A. So that's, I would just expect that you'll do your presentation now, unless you ask me any questions between now and the end of the semester. Now, project B then is what I want to also kind of emphasize. I want to see, you know, just kind of get an update on this. You know, everyone should have a topic by now, and they should be implementing it. Remember, this is worth also the other half of your term project grade. Doesn't need to be that big, but I just want to know what topic it is that you're going to present and demo. So remember, you need to do some kind of a demo. All right, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to break you up into the breakout rooms by group, the groups that you're assigned to. And then after that, I'll just spend like 3 minutes at most with every group, just to make, get some clue of where everybody is. And then after that, if we still have time, we can just go back to the firewalls lab. But at this point in the semester, you know, we're in week 9 or 10, so I definitely want to make sure and double check that everything is going well here. So let's do this now. I'm just going to stop the recording. So I'm not going to record.